The piercing sound of a gunshot shatters the eerie silence of a bombed-out London street. A man's agonized scream follows, echoing through the rubble-strewn alleyways. As the acrid smell of gunpowder dissipates, we see a figure stumbling through the debris of what was once a proud Victorian building. Blood seeps through his fingers as he clutches what remains of his left arm, leaving a macabre trail in his wake. This is Hans Müller, a man whose life is about to change forever, a Nazi spy on the brink of an extraordinary act of redemption. The year is 1944, and Europe is engulfed in the flames of the Second World War. But to understand how Hans found himself in this moment, bleeding and desperate on the streets of London, we must go back to 1939, when the world teetered on the brink of chaos, and a young German man made a choice that would set him on this fateful path. Hans Müller was born in 1915 in the picturesque town of Heidelberg. His childhood was marked by the aftermath of the Great War, the humiliation of Germany's defeat, the economic hardships that followed. Yet, within the walls of the Müller household, a different Germany persisted. Hans's father, a professor of literature at Heidelberg University, instilled in his son a love for the arts and a belief in the fundamental equality of all people. As Hans came of age, however, the world around him was changing. The Nazi Party's rise to power brought with it a tide of nationalism and anti-Semitism that seemed unstoppable. Hans watched with growing unease as friends and neighbors embraced the new ideology, as books were burned in the university square where his father once lectured. In the summer of 1938, everything changed. Hans's father, vocal in his opposition to the Nazi regime, disappeared. The official story was that he had fled the country, abandoning his family. But Hans knew the truth. He had seen the black cars arrive in the dead of night, had heard his mother's muffled sobs. Alone and afraid, Hans made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. He joined the Abwehr, Nazi Germany's military intelligence service. It wasn't out of belief in the Nazi ideology, but out of a desperate hope that from within the system, he might be able to protect what remained of his family, and perhaps even uncover the truth about his father's fate. The training was grueling. For months, Hans was drilled in the arts of espionage, code-breaking, surveillance, hand-to-hand combat. He learned to adopt new identities as easily as changing clothes, to lie convincingly even under the most intense scrutiny. All the while, he buried his doubts and misgivings deep within himself, constructing a facade of the perfect Nazi agent. In August 1939, as Europe held its breath in anticipation of war, Hans received his first major assignment. He was to be inserted into Britain, deep undercover, to gather intelligence on British military plans. It was a mission of utmost importance, one that could tip the balance of the coming conflict. Under the cover of night, Hans was smuggled across the channel on a small fishing boat. The journey was treacherous, the small vessel tossed about by angry waves as Royal Navy patrols searched the waters. Hans spent those long hours huddled in the boat's hold, his mind racing with fears and doubts. What if he was discovered? What if he couldn't maintain his cover? And beneath it all, a deeper, more troubling question. Was he doing the right thing? As dawn broke on September 1st, 1939, Hans set foot on British soil. The same day, hundreds of miles away, German tanks rolled across the Polish border, igniting the spark that would soon engulf the world in war. Hans felt the weight of history on his shoulders as he made his way to London, armed with nothing but his wits and a fake identity as a Swiss banker named Thomas Becker. The early days of his mission were a delicate dance of establishing his cover and making the right connections. Hans, now Thomas, took up residence in a modest flat in Kensington, carefully cultivating the image of a neutral expatriate sympathetic to the British cause. He joined a local chess club, became a regular at a pub frequented by civil servants, and even volunteered for air raid warden duty. All the while, he was watching, listening, gathering scraps of information to feed back to his handlers in Berlin. As weeks turned into months, Hans found himself increasingly torn. The London he experienced was not the decadent, degenerate society he had been led to believe existed. Instead, he found a city of resilient, dignified people facing the prospect of war with grim determination. He watched as children were evacuated to the countryside, as barrage balloons rose above the city skyline, as ordinary citizens prepared to defend their homes and their way of life. The Blitz began in September 1940, and with it came a new level of horror. Night after night, Hans huddled in air raid shelters with his neighbors, feeling the ground shake with each bomb that fell. He saw entire streets reduced to rubble, watched as rescue workers dug through debris to reach survivors. And yet, amidst the destruction, he witnessed incredible acts of courage and kindness. Strangers helping strangers, communities coming together in the face of adversity. It was during one of these raids that Hans met Sarah Cohen. She was a young Jewish woman who had managed to escape Germany just before the war, one of the lucky few who had seen the writing on the wall and gotten out in time. Huddled together in a cramped underground shelter, as the world above them burned, they began to talk. Sarah told Hans of her life in Berlin, of the gradual erosion of rights and dignity that had forced her to flee her home. She spoke of family left behind, of the growing rumors of camps and mass deportations. Her words, spoken softly in the flickering light of the shelter, cut through Hans like a knife. For the first time, he was forced to confront the full reality of what his country, what he was complicit in. That night marked the beginning of a profound change in Hans. As he continued to go through the motions of his spy duties, his heart was no longer in it. He began to feed his handlers information that was subtly, crucially wrong. Troop movements off by a few miles, shipping schedules delayed by a day or two. Small discrepancies that could mean the difference between life and death for Allied soldiers and civilians. As 1941 turned to 42, and then to 43, Hans's double life became increasingly precarious. He walked a razor's edge, constantly afraid of discovery from both sides. The stress took its toll. He lost weight, developed insomnia, jumped at every unexpected sound. But he also found moments of unexpected joy, particularly in his deepening friendship with Sarah. Their relationship, begun in that air raid shelter, blossomed despite the circumstances. They would meet for tea in small cafes, share ration coupons to put together meager but treasured meals, walk together in parks scarred by bomb craters but still defiantly green. Sarah's strength and resilience inspired Hans, reinforcing his determination to do what he could to undermine the Nazi war effort. If you're captivated by Hans's journey so far, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We have many more incredible stories of bravery and sacrifice from World War II that you won't want to miss. As the tide of the war began to turn, with German defeats in North Africa and the Soviet Union, Hans's handlers became increasingly desperate for actionable intelligence. The pressure on him intensified, and he knew that his subtle acts of sabotage wouldn't be enough for much longer. He needed to do something more, something that could make a real difference. The opportunity came in the spring of 1944. Through his carefully cultivated network of contacts, Hans learned of a planned German counteroffensive against the expected Allied invasion of France. It was the kind of intelligence that could change the course of the war, potentially saving thousands of lives. But passing it on to the Allies would almost certainly expose him as a double agent. For days, Hans agonized over the decision. He thought of his mother back in Germany, of the risk she would face if his treachery was discovered. He thought of Sarah, of the future they had tentatively begun to imagine together. And he thought of all the lives hanging in the balance, Allied and German alike, that could be saved if the information reached the right hands. In the end, the decision was made not in a moment of high drama, but in a quiet instant of clarity. Hans was walking in St. James's Park, watching children play on a playground built atop an air raid shelter. In that moment, seeing the resilience of life in the face of war, he knew what he had to do. The next few days were a blur of careful preparation. Hans encoded the intelligence about the German counteroffensive into a series of seemingly innocuous letters, to be passed to his British contact through a complex dead drop system. He tied up loose ends, destroyed incriminating documents, and prepared for every contingency he could think of. What Hans couldn't prepare for was the fact that he wasn't the only one making moves. Unbeknownst to him, German counterintelligence had grown suspicious of the recent failures of operations based on his intelligence. They had dispatched an agent to London to investigate, and that agent had been watching Hans for days. On the night of June 2nd, 1944, just days before the planned Allied invasion of Normandy, Hans set out to make his final dead drop. The streets of London were dark under strict blackout conditions, the only illumination coming from the occasional flash of searchlights scanning the sky for enemy planes. Hans moved carefully through the shadows, every sense alert for signs of danger. He was so focused on his destination that he almost missed the sound of footsteps behind him, almost but not quite. Years of training kicked in, and without breaking stride, he took a series of random turns, trying to confirm if he was indeed being followed. The game of cat and mouse led them through narrow alleys and bombed-out buildings, away from Hans's intended route. His heart raced as he realized the implications. If he was being followed, it meant his cover was blown. Everything, his mission, his life, Sarah's safety, was in jeopardy. Finally, in the shell of a building that had clearly seen better days, Hans decided to confront his pursuer. He ducked behind a crumbling wall, drew the pistol he carried but had hoped never to use, and waited. The confrontation, when it came, was swift and violent. Hans's follower, a man he recognized with a shock as a fellow-aware agent named Klaus, came around the corner with his own weapon drawn. For a moment, the two men stared at each other, a tableau of betrayal and conflicting loyalties. "Why, Hans?" Klaus asked, his voice a mixture of anger and genuine confusion. "Why betray everything we've fought for?" Hans didn't answer. Instead, he made a decision that would cost him dearly, but potentially save countless lives. He lunged at Klaus, knocking his aim off just as the other man fired. The bullet meant for Hans's heart instead tore through his left arm, shattering bone and ripping through muscle. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but Hans didn't let it stop him. With his good arm, he grappled with Klaus, their struggle fierce and desperate. They crashed through the deteriorating room, each fighting for survival. In the end, it was Hans's desperation that won out. With a final adrenaline-fueled effort, he managed to turn Klaus's gun against him. The shot rang out, deafening in the enclosed space, and Klaus slumped to the ground, eyes wide with shock and the light quickly fading from them. Hans stood there, panting and bleeding, the full impact of what had just happened washing over him. He had killed a man, not an faceless enemy, but someone he had trained with, someone who had been a friend. The war, which had seemed so distant even as bombs fell on London, had suddenly become intensely personal. But there was no time to dwell on it. The gunshots would have been heard, questions would be asked, and the vital intelligence he carried still needed to be delivered. Clutching his shattered arm, Hans staggered out of the building and into the night. We're approaching a crucial moment in Hans's story. The choices he makes in the next few minutes will have far-reaching consequences. If you're as invested in his fate as we are, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. You won't want to miss what happens next. What happened next will be seared into Hans's memory for the rest of his life. The pain from his arm was excruciating, each heartbeat sending fresh waves of agony through his body. The streets of London, once so familiar, now seemed like an alien landscape as he stumbled through them, leaving a trail of blood in his wake. His training told him to go to ground, to find a safe house and tend to his wounds. But the weight of the intelligence he carried drove him forward. He knew that every minute counted, that the information he had could save thousands of lives if it reached Allied command in time. It was in this state, half delirious with pain and blood loss, that Sarah found him. She had been on her way to meet him, worried by his recent distracted behavior. The sight of Hans, pale and bleeding, leaning against a wall in a dark alley, nearly stopped her heart. "Hans!" she cried out, rushing to his side. "What happened? We need to get you to a hospital." Hans shook his head weakly. "No time," he gasped. "Sarah, listen to me. I'm not who you think I am. I was a German spy. The look of shock and betrayal on Sarah's face was almost more than Hans could bear. But he pressed on, knowing that what he had to say was more important than any personal pain. "But I couldn't do it anymore," he continued. "I've been working against them, and now I have information that could help end the war. But I can't deliver it myself, not like this." Sarah's expression changed from betrayal to determination. Whatever her feelings about Hans's deception, she understood the gravity of the situation. "Tell me what do," she said simply. In hurried, pained whispers, Hans explained about the dead drop, about the encoded messages hidden within innocent-looking letters. He described the location, the recognition signals, everything his contact would need to know. As he spoke, the sound of air raid sirens began to wail in the distance. The war, ever present, was intruding on this private drama. They both knew that they were out of time. "Go," Hans said, pushing Sarah away with his good arm. "Get that information to them. It's more important than anything else right now." Sarah hesitated for a moment, torn between her duty to the larger cause and her concern for Hans. In that moment, Hans saw in her eyes all the future they might have had together, a future that was now lost to them. "Go," Hans insisted, more forcefully this time. And with a last anguished look, Sarah turned and ran into the night. Left alone, Hans allowed himself a moment of weakness. He slid down the wall, leaving a smear of blood, and sat heavily on the ground. The pain in his arm had faded to a dull throb, replaced by a spreading coldness that he knew wasn't a good sign. As he sat there, waiting for whatever would come next, Hans's thoughts wandered. He thought of his childhood in Heidelberg, of his father's lessons about right and wrong. He thought of his early days in London, of the gradual realization that he was on the wrong side of history. And he thought of Sarah, of the brief happiness they had found amidst the chaos of war. The sound of approaching footsteps roused him from his reverie. For a wild moment, he thought Sarah had come back for him, but as he looked up, he saw instead the stern faces of two British soldiers, their rifles trained on him. "Don't move," one of them barked. "Hands where we can see them." With a grimace of pain, Hans raised his good arm. "I surrender," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I have a story you're going to want to hear." The next few hours passed in a blur for Hans. He was taken into custody, his wounds treated by army medics. The loss of blood had been severe, and for a time, it was touch and go whether he would survive. But Hans clung to life with the same determination that had driven him to turn against his handlers. As he drifted in and out of consciousness, Hans was aware of intense discussions happening around him. He caught snippets of conversation. German spy, valuable intelligence, Operation Overlord. He didn't know if Sarah had succeeded in delivering the information, if his sacrifice had been worth it. It was 3 days later, as he lay in a secure hospital ward, that Hans got his answer. A gruff-looking man in the uniform of a British Army colonel entered his room, flanked by 2 guards. "Mr. Mueller," the colonel said, his tone neutral, "you've caused quite a stir." Hans tried to sit up straighter in his hospital bed, wincing as the movement jostled his injured arm. "Sir," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse, "I'm prepared to face the consequences of my actions." The colonel studied him for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, to Hans's surprise, he pulled up a chair and sat down beside the bed. "Mr. Mueller, I'm Colonel Ainsworth. I'm here to inform you that the information you provided has been verified and acted upon. It's already saving lives." A wave of relief washed over Hans, so intense that for a moment he couldn't speak. When he finally found his voice, it was thick with emotion. "And the invasion? Has it begun?" "Colonel Ainsworth no dead. Operation Overlord commenced on June 6th. Your intelligence about the German counteroffensive plans was invaluable. It allowed us to adjust our strategies and potentially save thousands of lives." Hans closed his eyes, letting the weight of this information sink in. Everything he had gone through, the pain, the fear, the loss, it had all been worth it. "There's something else you should know," the colonel continued. The young woman who delivered your information, Sarah Cohen, I believe her name is, she's been quite insistent about seeing you. At the mention of Sarah's name, Hans's eyes snapped open. Is she all right? She wasn't hurt, was she? The colonel's stern expression softened slightly. She's fine. Brave young woman. She's been working with us, helping to decode some of the additional intelligence you provided. She's also been vouching for you rather vehemently. Hans felt a mix of pride and sadness. Sarah had always been strong, always stood up for what she believed in. It was one of the things that had drawn him to her. But he also knew that his deception had likely destroyed any chance of a future together. Now, Colonel Ainsworth said, his tone becoming more businesslike, we need to discuss your situation. You understand, of course, that despite the value of your information, you were still operating as an enemy agent on British soil. Hans nodded slowly. I understand, sir. I'm prepared to accept whatever punishment is deemed appropriate. The colonel leaned back in his chair, regarding Hans thoughtfully. It's not quite that simple, Mr. Mueller. Your actions have put us in a rather unique position. On one hand, you've committed serious crimes against the Crown. On the other, your defection and the intelligence you provided have been instrumental in our war effort. Hans listened intently, hardly daring to hope for leniency. After much discussion, the colonel continued, it's been decided that you will be offered a choice. Option 1. You will be held as a prisoner of war for the duration of the conflict, after which you will face a military tribunal for your actions. Hans nodded, having expected something along these lines. And option 2, sir? Option 2 is more unconventional, Colonel Ainsworth said. We believe you could still be of use to the Allied cause. Your knowledge of German intelligence operations, your training, your contacts, they could all prove invaluable. If you agree, you would work with us, under strict supervision of course, to help counter Nazi intelligence efforts. The offer took Hans by surprise. It was more than he had dared to hope for. A chance not just to avoid punishment, but to actively work against the regime he had come to despise. There is, of course, a catch, the colonel added. Accepting this offer would mean cutting all ties with your past life. As far as the world is concerned, Hans Mueller would cease to exist. You would be given a new identity, and after the war, you would need to build a new life, likely far from Europe. You would never be able to contact your family or friends in Germany again. The weight of the decision pressed down on Hans. He thought of his mother, still in Heidelberg, who would never know what had become of her son. He thought of his father, whose fate he would now never discover. But he also thought of all the lives he could potentially save, all the good he could do. May I have some time to consider, sir? Hans asked. Colonel Ainsworth nodded. You have until tomorrow morning. I'll return then for your decision. As the colonel left, Hans sank back into his pillows, his mind whirling with the implications of the choice before him. It was then that he noticed a small figure standing in the doorway, Sarah. She looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes, but to Hans, she had never been more beautiful. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the air heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Sarah stepped into the room. I heard everything, she said softly. Hans, Sarah, I'm so sorry, Hans interrupted. I never meant to deceive you. You have to believe that what we have, it's real. Sarah sat on the edge of his bed, taking his good hand in hers. I know, she said. I was angry at first, hurt, but then I thought about everything you risked, everything you sacrificed. I understand why you did what you did. Hans felt a glimmer of hope. Can you ever forgive me? Sarah squeezed his hand. I already have. But Hans, what are you going to do? This decision, it's your whole life. Hans looked down at their intertwined hands. I don't know, he admitted. Working against the Nazis, trying to make amends for the things I've done, it feels right. But the cost. You'd be alone, Sarah said softly. You'd have to start over, become someone new. Hans looked up at her, a sudden thought occurring to him. Unless I wasn't alone. He took a deep breath. "Sarah, I know this is sudden, and I know I have no right to ask, but if I accept their offer, would you consider coming with me? After the war, I mean. We could start a new life together, somewhere far from all of this." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. For a heart-stopping moment, Hans thought he had overstepped, but then a slow smile spread across her face. "Hans Mueller," she said, "are you proposing to me in a military hospital while under guard for being a German spy?" Despite everything, Hans couldn't help but laugh. "I suppose I am," he said, "though I get down on one knee if I could actually stand up right now." Sarah's laugh joined his, a moment of joy amidst the gravity of their situation. As their laughter subsided, she looked at him seriously. "Yes," she said simply. "Whatever you decide, wherever you go, I'll be there with you." The weight that had been pressing down on Hans's chest lifted. He felt as though he could breathe freely for the first time in years. With Sarah by his side, he knew he could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The next morning, when Colonel Ainsworth returned, Hans was ready with his answer. He would accept the offer to work with Allied intelligence. He would leave behind his old life and embrace a new one, fighting against the evil he had once served. The months that followed were intense and often dangerous. Hans worked tirelessly, using his knowledge to help the Allies anticipate and counter German intelligence operations. His insights proved invaluable, contributing to numerous victories both large and small. As the war ground on, Hans and Sarah's relationship deepened. They were married in a small, private ceremony in the spring of 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender. It was a bittersweet moment for Hans, knowing that his mother would never know of his marriage, his new life, or the grandchildren that would come in the years ahead. After the war, true to their agreement, Hans and Sarah were given new identities and relocated to Canada. They settled in a small town in Ontario, where Hans took a job as a high school German teacher and Sarah worked as a nurse. To their neighbors, they were Henry and Sophie Marshall, a quiet couple with a slight accent and a tendency to wake up from nightmares. The transition to civilian life was far from easy. Hans, now Henry, struggled with the weight of his past and the constant fear of discovery. Every unexpected knock at the door, every curious glance from a stranger sent his heart racing. He would find himself scanning crowds for familiar faces, half expecting to see a former colleague or handler who might expose him. Sarah, ever as rock, helped him through the worst of these moments. She would hold him during the night terrors that plagued him, whispering soothing words in the darkness. During the day, she worked tirelessly to help them build their new life, her strength and resilience a constant source of inspiration for Hans. Their first years in Canada were a delicate balance of establishing their new identities and dealing with the trauma of their past. Hans threw himself into his teaching, finding solace in sharing his love of the German language and literature with his students. He was careful to stick to the curriculum, avoiding any topics that might lead to uncomfortable questions about his own experiences in Germany. Sarah, meanwhile, became a beloved figure in the local hospital. Her compassion and skill as a nurse earned her the respect of her colleagues and the gratitude of her patients. She found purpose in her work, seeing it as a way to balance the scales against the suffering she had witnessed during the war. In 1948, their first child was born, a daughter they named Rachel. Hans held his newborn daughter with a mixture of joy and terror. Joy at the miracle of new life, and terror at the thought of the world she was entering. As he looked into Rachel's innocent eyes, he made a silent vow to do everything in his power to make the world a better place for her. The arrival of Rachel brought new challenges and new joys to their life. Hans found himself constantly amazed by the simple wonder of watching his daughter grow. Her first steps, her first words. Each milestone was a celebration of life and hope. But with these joys came new fears. How much should they tell Rachel about their past? How could they protect her from the shadows that still lingered over their lives? As Rachel grew older, Hans and Sarah decided to tell her a simplified version of their story. They explained that they had come from Europe after the war, that they had changed their names for safety reasons. They spoke in gentle terms about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Rachel absorbed these lessons with a seriousness beyond her years, seeming to understand instinctively the weight of her parents' past. In 1953, their family grew again with the birth of their son, David. Hans, more settled now in his new life, embraced fatherhood with a joy that sometimes surprised him. He would spend hours playing with his children, telling them stories, carefully edited, from his youth in Germany, teaching them chess and the basics of the German language. As the years passed, Hans found a measure of peace in his new life. The nightmares became less frequent, the paranoia less intense. He became known in the community as a dedicated teacher, respected for his knowledge and his ability to inspire a love of learning in his students. But the past was never far away. In 1961, the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Israel brought the horrors of the Nazi regime back into the public consciousness. Hans watched the news coverage with a sick fascination, unable to look away but tormented by the memories it stirred. One evening, after a particularly difficult day of following the trial, Hans found himself sitting alone in the darkened living room, a glass of scotch in his hand. Sarah found him there, staring into space with tears in his eyes. "I could have been one of them," he said softly as she sat beside him. "If I hadn't made the choice I did, if I hadn't met you, I could have been standing in that dock with Eichmann." Sarah took his hand, her touch grounding him as it had so many times before. "But you're not," she said firmly. "You made a different choice. You risked everything to do what was right." Hans nodded slowly, drawing strength from her words. "Sometimes I wonder if I've done enough," he admitted. "If I can ever truly make up for the things I did, the system I was part of." Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. "Maybe we can never fully atone for the past," she said finally. "But we can work every day to make the world a little better. And Hans, that's exactly what you've been doing." She gestured around their modest home, to the pictures of their children on the walls, to the stack of essays on the coffee table waiting for Hans to grade. "You're shaping young minds, teaching them to think critically, to question authority. You're raising our children to be compassionate, to stand up for what's right. That matters, Hans. It matters so much." Her words were a balm to his troubled soul, as they had been so many times over the years. Hans pulled her close, marveling yet again at the twist of fate that had brought this remarkable woman into his life. The Eichmann trial sparked a renewed interest in World War II and the Holocaust among Hans's students. Many of them, born after the war, were learning about these events in detail for the first time. Hans found himself walking a delicate line, wanting to ensure his students understood the gravity of what had happened without revealing his personal connection to the events. One day, a student asked him directly if he had fought in the war. Hans felt a moment of panic, but years of maintaining his cover allowed him to respond smoothly. "I was very young when the war ended," he said, which was true enough. "But I saw its effects firsthand in Europe before coming to Canada." The student nodded, accepting this answer, but the question stayed with Hans, making him wonder how long he could continue to hide his past and whether he should. As the 1960s progressed, Hans watched with a mixture of hope and trepidation as the world changed around him. The civil rights movement in the United States reminded him of the power of standing up against injustice, but also of the deep-seated prejudices that could lurk within societies. The Cold War tensions brought back memories of his intelligence work, making him grateful for the quiet life he now led. In 1968, Rachel, now 20 years old, came home from university with news that shook Hans to his core. She had decided to spend a semester studying abroad in Germany. "It'll be an amazing opportunity to practice the language, Dad," she said excitedly over dinner, "and to learn more about our heritage." Hans felt as though the ground had dropped out from beneath him. The thought of his daughter in Germany, possibly walking the same streets he had walked as a young man, filled him with a terror he hadn't felt in years. Sarah, sensing his distress, quickly changed the subject. But later that night, they discussed the situation in hushed tones. "We can't forbid her from going," Sarah said pragmatically. She's an adult now, and it would only make her suspicious if we reacted too strongly against it. Hans nodded, knowing she was right but hating it nonetheless. But what if someone recognizes her? What if she starts asking questions about our family history? Sarah took his hand, her touch as comforting now as it had been all those years ago in London. Hans, the war has been over for more than 20 years. The chances of anyone recognizing her are slim to none. And if she does start asking questions, maybe it's time we told her the full truth. The idea of revealing his past to his children terrified Hans, but he knew Sarah was right. Rachel and David were adults now, capable of understanding the complexities of the choices he had made. So, on a warm summer evening, with Rachel set to leave for Germany in just a few weeks, Hans and Sarah sat their children down and told them everything. They spoke of Hans's recruitment into the Abwehr, of his time as a spy in London, of his growing disillusionment with the Nazi regime. They told them about Hans's decision to turn against his handlers, about the intelligence he provided that helped save Allied lives. Rachel and David listened in stunned silence, their expressions a mix of shock, confusion, and awe. When Hans finished speaking, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then David, always the more outspoken of the two, asked, "Why are you telling us this now?" Hans looked at Sarah, drawing strength from her presence as he had so many times before. "Because we've carried this secret for too long," he said. "Because you deserve to know the truth about your family history. And because I'm tired of being afraid." Rachel, tears in her eyes, reached out and took her father's hand. "Dad," she said softly, "what you did, it was incredibly brave." Hans felt a weight lift from his shoulders at his daughter's words. He had spent so many years fearing their judgment, fearing that they would see him as a traitor or a coward. To hear understanding and even admiration in Rachel's voice was more than he had ever dared to hope for. The conversation lasted long into the night, with Rachel and David asking questions about every aspect of their parents' past. Hans and Sarah answered as honestly as they could, filling in the gaps of their family history that had always been shrouded in mystery. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Rachel made a decision. "I still want to go to Germany," she said firmly. "But now, I want to go to understand, to see where you came from, Dad, and to try to understand the forces that shaped your life." Hans felt a complex mix of emotions at his daughter's words. Pride in her maturity and desire to understand, fear for what she might discover, and a deep, abiding love for this remarkable young woman he and Sarah had raised. Rachel's time in Germany became a journey of discovery for the entire family. She would write long letters home, describing the places she visited, the people she met, the lingering scars of war she observed in the country's landscape and psyche. Her perspective, that of a young Canadian seeing Germany for the first time, helped Hans see his homeland in a new light. One letter in particular stood out. Rachel had visited Heidelberg, the city where Hans had grown up. She described walking along the Philosophenweg, the same path where Hans had often walked with his father as a boy. "I stood there, looking out over the city," Rachel wrote, "and I tried to imagine you as a young man, Dad, full of dreams and ambitions. I wonder what Grandpa would have thought of the choices you made, of the life you built. I think he would have been proud." Hans read those words with tears in his eyes, feeling a connection to his long-lost father that he hadn't experienced in decades. He wrote back to Rachel, sharing memories of his childhood in Heidelberg that he had long kept buried. It was a cathartic experience, allowing him to reclaim parts of his past that he had thought lost forever. As the years passed, Hans found himself more at peace with his history. The fear of discovery gradually faded, replaced by a quiet pride in the life he and Sarah had built, in the children they had raised, in the positive impact they had made on their community. In 1985, 40 years after the end of the war, Hans received a letter that would change his life once again. It was from a historian researching the role of German intelligence during World War II. Somehow, the historian had pieced together fragments of Hans's story and had tracked him down in Canada. The letter was respectful, assuring Hans that the historian had no intention of exposing his identity without permission. Instead, he was reaching out in the hope that Hans would be willing to share his experiences, to help fill in the gaps in the historical record. Hans's first instinct was to ignore the letter, to protect the life he had built. But as he discussed it with Sarah and his children, he began to see it as an opportunity to share his story on his own terms, to ensure that the complexities of his experiences weren't lost to history. After much deliberation, Hans agreed to speak with the historian, under the condition that his current identity would be protected. Over a series of interviews, he shared his story in full for the first time since his debriefing by Allied intelligence all those years ago. The process was emotionally grueling, forcing Hans to relive some of the darkest moments of his life. But it was also cathartic, allowing him to contextualize his experiences within the broader sweep of history. When the historian's book was published the following year, with Hans's story featured as an anonymous case study, it sparked a new conversation about the moral complexities of intelligence work and the nature of redemption in times of war. Hans read the book with a sense of surreal detachment, seeing his life laid out in academic prose. But it was the epilogue that moved him most deeply. The historian concluded, "The story of Agent X serves as a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, individual choices matter. It challenges us to consider the nature of loyalty, the possibility of redemption, and the enduring power of the human conscience. In a world that often seems divided into clear categories of heroes and villains, Agent X reminds us that the reality is far more complex." His story is a testament to the idea that it's never too late to choose a different path, to stand up for what's right, even at great personal cost. Hans Müller, the Nazi spy who lost his arm but saved his soul, died in 1988, surrounded by his loving family. He left behind a legacy of courage, sacrifice, and the enduring power of choosing to do what's right, even in the face of overwhelming odds. In his final days, Hans reflected on the long, strange journey of his life. He thought of the young man he had been in Heidelberg, full of uncertainty and fear. He thought of his time in London, of the moment he had decided to turn against everything he had been taught to believe. He thought of the pain and the loss, the fear and the doubt. But mostly, he thought of Sarah, of Rachel and David, of the life they had built together. As he lay in his hospital bed, his family gathered around him. Hans felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for much of his life. He had made mistakes, yes, but he had also found the courage to correct them. He had known the worst of humanity, but he had also experienced its best: love, forgiveness, the chance for redemption. With his last breaths, Hans shared a final piece of wisdom with his children and grandchildren. "Life is full of choices," he said softly. "Some big, some small, but it's those choices that define us. Always strive to make the right choice, even when it's the hardest one. And remember, it's never too late to change your path." Hans Müller's story serves as a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, individual acts of bravery can change the course of history. It challenges us to question our assumptions, to stand up for what's right, and to recognize the humanity in others, even those we've been taught to see as enemies. As we reflect on Hans's journey, we're reminded of the power each of us holds to make a difference, to stand up against injustice, and to choose compassion over hatred. In a world that still grapples with conflict and division, his story serves as a beacon of hope and a call to action. Let us carry forward the lesson of Hans Müller's sacrifice. Let us strive to see the humanity in all people, to have the courage to question our beliefs, and to be willing to sacrifice for what is right. For it is through such actions, big and small, that we can build a world of peace, understanding, and justice. In the annals of World War II, there are many tales of heroism and sacrifice, but few are as complex and morally nuanced as that of Hans Müller, the Nazi spy who lost his arm but saved his soul. His story teaches us that redemption is possible, that it's never too late to choose the right path, and that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism come from the most unexpected places. As we conclude this remarkable tale, we invite you to reflect on your own life, your own choices. What would you be willing to sacrifice for what you believe is right? How can you make a difference in your own community, your own world? Remember, history is not just made by grand gestures and decisive battles. It's made every day by ordinary people making extraordinary choices. Hans Müller was one such person. Who will be next? Perhaps it could be you. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most compelling stories of World War II. If you've been moved by Hans's tale, we encourage you to share it with others. The lessons of history are too important to be forgotten. This is the end of our documentary, but it's not the end of the story. The legacy of Hans Müller and countless others like him lives on in the choices we make every day. Let us strive to be worthy of their sacrifice, to build a world where such choices are no longer necessary. But perhaps you're wondering, what became of Hans's family after his passing? How did his story continue to impact those he left behind? Let's take a moment to explore the ripple effects of one man's choices across generations. Rachel, Hans's daughter, was profoundly affected by her father's revelations and her time in Germany. Inspired by his story, she pursued a career in international relations, specializing in conflict resolution. Her work took her to war-torn regions around the world, where she applied the lessons she had learned from her father's life: the importance of empathy, the power of individual action, and the possibility of redemption. In 2001, Rachel found herself in Bosnia, working on reconciliation efforts in the aftermath of the Balkan conflicts. As she sat across from former enemies, encouraging them to see each other's humanity, she often thought of her father. She would recall how he had crossed lines of loyalty and nationality in the name of what was right, and it gave her strength to continue her difficult work. David, Hans's son, took a different but equally impactful path. Moved by his father's story and Sarah's work as a nurse, he became a doctor, specializing in treating refugees and victims of war. His work with Doctors Without Borders took him to some of the most dangerous and desperate places on earth. In a refugee camp in Sudan in 2005, David treated a young boy who had lost an arm in a bomb blast. As he worked to save the child's life, he couldn't help but think of his father, of the arm Hans had sacrificed so long ago. In that moment, David felt a deep connection to his father's legacy, a sense that he was continuing the work Hans had begun, the work of healing the wounds of war, both physical and emotional. Hans's grandchildren, too, carried forward his legacy in their own ways. His oldest granddaughter became a historian, focusing on ethical decision-making during times of conflict. His grandson, inspired by Hans's teaching career, became an educator himself, always emphasizing to his students the importance of critical thinking and moral courage. Even those who never met Hans were touched by his story. The historian's book, with its anonymous account of Agent X, became required reading in many university courses on ethics and intelligence work. Students around the world debated the moral complexities of Hans's choices, grappling with questions of loyalty, patriotism, and personal responsibility. In 2015, a German filmmaker, intrigued by the story of Agent X, began work on a documentary series exploring the lives of individuals who had resisted the Nazi regime from within. Though Hans's real name was never used, his story formed a central part of the series, introducing a new generation to the concept of moral courage in the face of authoritarian power. The series sparked renewed interest in the stories of ordinary people who had found the strength to resist during World War II. Historians began to dig deeper, uncovering more tales of quiet heroism, of individuals who, like Hans, had made the difficult choice to stand against injustice, often at great personal cost. In Canada, the small Ontario town where Hans and Sarah had made their home saw an unexpected surge of interest. Though few knew the details of the Marshals' past, the general outline of their story, refugees who had rebuilt their lives after the war, was well known. The town began to take pride in its history as a haven for those fleeing conflict, leading to new initiatives to welcome and support modern-day refugees. Sarah, who outlived Hans by nearly a decade, became a beloved figure in the community. In her later years, She began to share carefully edited versions of their story with local school groups, emphasizing the importance of standing up for one's beliefs and the power of forgiveness and redemption. When Sarah passed away in 1997, the town came together to honor her memory. At her funeral, the mayor spoke of the Marshalls as embodying the best of Canadian values: courage, compassion, and the willingness to welcome those in need. Though he didn't know the full story, his words rang true for those who did. In 2020, as the world faced new challenges and conflicts, Hans and Sarah's great-grandchildren discovered a cache of old letters in their parents' attic. These letters, exchanged between Hans and Sarah over the years, offered a deeply personal glimpse into their experiences during and after the war. The family debated what to do with this treasure trove of historical material. Eventually, they decided to donate the letters to a museum dedicated to preserving the stories of World War II refugees, with the provision that Hans and Sarah's real names be protected. The museum created a powerful exhibit around the letters, using them to illustrate the long-term impacts of war and the ongoing struggles of those who live with its memories. Visitors to the exhibit were deeply moved by the love story at its heart. The tale of two people who had found each other amidst the chaos of war and built a life together in a new land. One of the most poignant items in the exhibit was the last letter Hans had written to Sarah, just days before his death. In it, he reflected on their life together. "My dear Sarah, as I look back on our life together, I am filled with wonder and gratitude. We have come so far from those dark days in London. Sometimes I still can't believe that we made it, that we built this beautiful life together. I know there were times when the weight of our past felt unbearable. There were nights when the memories threatened to overwhelm us. But we always found our way back to each other, back to the light. You have been my strength, my conscience, my heart. Without you, I might have been lost to the darkness that once consumed me. You helped me find a way to live with my past, to use it as a force for good rather than letting it destroy me. Our children, our grandchildren, they are our greatest achievement. In them, I see hope for the future. They carry the best of us forward, and I have faith that they will continue to work towards a better world. As I face the end of my journey, I am at peace. Whatever mistakes I made, whatever darkness I once embraced, I know that in the end, I chose the right path. And that path led me to you, to our family, to a life filled with love and purpose. Thank you, my love, for everything, for your strength, your forgiveness, your unwavering belief in the goodness that can bloom even in the darkest of places. Yours always and forever, Hans. This letter, more than anything else, encapsulated the message of Hans's life. That love, courage, and the choice to do what is right can ultimately overcome even the darkest chapters of human history. As we close this chapter of our exploration into the life of Hans Müller, we are left with a profound sense of the power of individual choice. One man's decision, made in a moment of moral clarity amidst the fog of war, rippled out across decades, touching countless lives and contributing, in its own small way, to the healing of the deep wounds left by World War II. Hans's story reminds us that history is not just a sequence of grand events and sweeping forces. It is also the sum of millions of individual choices made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. It challenges us to consider our own choices, to ask ourselves what we stand for and what we would be willing to sacrifice for our principles. In a world that still grapples with conflict, prejudice, and injustice, the legacy of Hans Müller serves as both a comfort and a call to action. It reassures us that even in the darkest of times, there is always the possibility of choosing a different path. And it challenges us to have the courage to make that choice, to stand up for what is right, even when it comes at great personal cost. As we face the challenges of our own time, let us carry with us the lessons of Hans's life. Let us strive to see the humanity in all people, even those we are taught to see as enemies. Let us have the courage to question our own beliefs and the systems we are part of. And let us never underestimate the power of individual action to change the course of history. For in the end, The story of Hans Mueller is not just about one man's journey from darkness to light. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the power of love to transform lives, and the enduring hope that, no matter how dark the night, a new dawn is always possible. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most compelling and complex stories of World War II. As we end this documentary, we encourage you to reflect on your own life, your own choices. How can you contribute to building a more just and peaceful world? What will be your legacy? Remember, every great journey begins with a single step. Every monumental change starts with one person deciding to make a difference. Hans Mueller made his choice. Now it's our turn.